Hi, and welcome to another episode of ID Cyber Sessions. I'm Alice, and this is Steve, and we both work at ID Cyber.
Today we are speaking with Dr Iain Campbell, who, among many things, advises official organisations in AI and healthcare. He has recently chaired a roundtable at the House of Lords on behalf of the Healthcare Leadership Academy. He's the lead director for Scotland and head of AI policy, ethics and transformation. So, with those minor titles, what else do you do?
Thanks for the very compendious introduction. I have rather a lot of hats in life. I am a local care of the elderly consultant, which I use to balance my many other hats in life. I think you've introduced the AI ones. I do lots of things, and I suspect we'll be talking about some of those later on in the show. Yeah, but day-to-day life, most of the time, medical wards, seeing care of the elderly patients. But I do, as you've suggested, do a number of other things in the policy development, sort of public affairs type space for various hats. And Healthcare Leadership Academy wise, we train healthcare leaders essentially to run healthcare organisations, both in the NHS and also some of them go into pharma, some of them will do their own startups, some of them go into GP practice, which is essentially running your own little business. A lot of people don't realise many of those are actually private little businesses that have a contract with the NHS. So.
Some people might think it's unusual for a medical doctor to be so interested in technology. How did you get into it? Has it always been a passion?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think medical doctor, as I say, is one of my many hats. I've been chairman of the board of lots of organisations. But I got into tech basically as a child growing up with computers. I mean, I'm probably quite unusual in that I learned to type before I learned to write.
Oh,
And I
wow,
don't think
okay.
there's many people, born at my stage in life that can say that. I literally was in a household with, I mean, at the time, these were ancient back then, but I mean, there were BBC Masters, BBC Micros around the house, 386s. So I grew up with, BBC Basic, with, Word Perfect processors, DOS, Unix, you name it. So 3.1 felt like an upgrade when I got it. So I've grown up with computers in a way that, it's always been part of my life. I was the 6-year-old who I was dyslexic. I am dyslexic as well. And I was the 6-year-old sitting in my primary two class, which for those in England is, like the second year of your primary school. Sitting there, they're trying to teach me phonics, which as a dyslexic might have done me a lot of good. But I was the one that, this is a BBC Master, Starcat, let's see what's on this disc. And I was the one I discovered that had a wee reward game for River Rapids. And I was the kid that wrote a little program, very, very simple, label A, little line codes at the beginning, run River Rapid, go to label A, and sat and played the rewards for about an hour and a half. You just wouldn't think it of a 6-year-old. So tech has sort of been something I've been very into since more or less I was able to talk.
Wow.
We've got someone who's got a lot of background in tech, to be honest, with us. So we've talked about tech. So how did you become involved in policy development of all things?
Yeah, so essentially, I tend to get involved in many things in life. One of the things that happened, anyone that contracts, and plenty of people contract in the IT space, will have heard, and sometimes a little shiver down the spine of the term IR35 and off payroll. And when those reforms were put out into the healthcare, the petri dish for these reforms, not the older ones, the more recent changes, was the public sector. So effectively, I ended up as Secretary General of a trade association representing locum self-employed, essentially doctors, nurses, everything, dietitians, you name it, all the self-employed healthcare workers. Through that, I actually ended up dealing with a lot of finance sector workers, IT contractors, and yeah, I just sort of eventually, from feeding into consultations and things like that, ended up getting invited to give oral evidence to select committees and things like that. And once you're in that kind of circuit and know how these kind of things work, you start getting contacted and emailed. You get on various mailing lists and people contact you. But sometimes things that I don't know much about as well. Sometimes I have to say, sorry, no, that's really not for me. But yeah, so a lot of different diverse stuff, including tax, employment law type stuff, and lots of other things, including staffing strategy and things like that. And when you start getting on policy development roundtables and things, you start networking, you start meeting people, and you start sort of seeing behind the curtains as to how things operate, essentially.
Wow. And thinking about your specialty, AI in healthcare, which, as Steve said to start with, you did recently chair a roundtable on at the House of Lords. What sort of uses are there for AI in healthcare?
My goodness, I think our landscape, we're going to be talking about the distant future, I think, soon. But I think that the potential is phenomenal. There is a thing where at the moment people looking at what things are capable of just now tend to slightly overestimate as well. I
Okay.
mean, you're dealing with models that can hallucinate, that can be a bit dangerous for certain types of things, and there are strategies to get around that. But I mean, we are looking at what the first hospital from that roundtable that's going to be implementing a large language model type solution in the actual clinical use is for summaries for discharges. And that is set to happen in about 18 months. They're currently piloting it. So it's happening, it's already starting. And, where things will go, I mean, we're already seeing research papers where they're doing research we could never do before because literally it creates so much data we couldn't process it. But machine learning approaches can handle things like that. So, for example, they take blood from people, put it through a mass spectrometer to isolate everything that's in it, and then feed all that data through to a language model, follow people up, not a language model, an artificial intelligence model, so a different type of model they're using. But anyway, the end result is they identified, for example, for Parkinson's, a paper published recently, about a month ago or something like that, that was found 7 new novel biomarkers that seemed to be able to predict who would go on to develop Parkinson's a long
Wow.
time before motor symptoms appeared.
Wow.
Problem is, we can't treat these people any differently yet, but this approach applied to so many other conditions is going to, I mean, research is going to get turbocharged in ways we've never seen before. Um, there are fallacies with some of these models, so that there are things that they're not very good at. There are some things, some types of models do better than others. Um, Clinically, I think we're going to be seeing things like we talk of bed management. So to give you a bit of a background, hospitals, you can think of them like a big system with a lot of ambulances arriving in A&E at one end and a lot of people happily, hopefully, going home at the other end. And in the middle, there's only so many beds. And some of these beds have oxygen. Some patients need oxygen, some don't. Some of them have side rooms. Some patients, might be an infection risk to other people and they need to be there. Sometimes there are negative pressure rooms. So that's like if you've got, for example, back in the COVID times where COVID used to get this sort of thing, you would think, if the door opens, all the air goes in. And therefore, you're unlikely to get an infection spreading out. And there is a very, very stressful game played by some very talented people, which I always think of a bit like, I don't know if you've ever seen these jigsaw puzzles, but the ones you can't pick the pieces up, they're all there and you have to slide them around. Where you have to I've got so many beds, I've got so many things I need to achieve, and how can I shuffle things to get everyone where they need to be? Now, these are the sort of things that not one model, but probably concerts of different models working together might be able to do better than we can. And they'll be able to, for example, read the notes of all the patients in the hospital at once, identify, well, these people are waiting for these wee silly jobs to be done before they can move on or go. Shouldn't that be highlighted? Now, at the moment, what happens is some poor, overworked human beings who are phenomenal, they charge up and down hospitals like crazy, asking everyone what's going on and feeding back to meetings and things in order to try and identify these. But nobody can compete with the sheer speed at which some of these things can be processed. So, with caveats, there are so many areas that are going to be transformed. Eventually, we'll get to, I mean, we've got I'm now telling you a lot of things, but sepsis, for example. So there are models being trialed in some hospitals in America that seem to be reducing. I say seem to because we always need to see more data before we can form firm conclusions. But initially, look like they're reducing, sepsis mortality. But some suggestions up to 20%. But I believe it when I see peer-reviewed papers to read. May well be as billed, often is, but we go on the evidence. But we're already seeing, I think, a lot of these sort of applications. If we look at a lot of things we do in healthcare are very much processing huge amounts of data. We have to read everyone's notes. We have to look at blood tests, and much of it's text or numerical data. And these are things that lend themselves really well to training a model on. So a lot of things, I think, in summary. That one company, Hippocratic AI, was valued at 500 million in February, and it's doing low-hanging fruit with administration and billing things, maybe a bit bigger in the US market, but also I think looking at the likes of the discharge summary type applications that we mentioned. So huge potential for transformation.
It's incredible work, to be honest, and I agree that the speed that things can be done with an AI is exponential compared to a human. So obviously, it being healthcare, surely there has to be regulation. So how is this going to be regulated?
Absolutely. So the one of the things that we discussed, that was one of the things we discussed at the roundtable, and essentially, um, the UK government is committed to a light touch approach, which in some ways is useful in a permissive way in terms of, this is potentially something that's going to ultimately be as big as the Industrial Revolution and its potential to transform a lot of jobs. Um, in healthcare, I think we need to be especially cautious. The approach they're using in healthcare at the moment is to apply medical device regulations to it. So that means, if you use a blood glucose monitor, that's a medical device, and there is a process for approving it. It's much simpler than getting drugs approved and much cheaper than getting drugs approved. They're treating AI as software. I suppose it might be better thought of many of these models as a sieve, not like it's coded. You put things in, you get an output. But they're calling it software as a medical device is the regulatory framework. And it's, putting it simply, a bodge which applies existing medical device regulations so that we can be permissive and have a framework. It's much better than nothing. But I think there are special considerations here with, training data. And, if you don't have diverse training data, if your training data underrepresents certain groups, then is the model as good at handling those groups? And at the moment, we're looking at just, don't know, how does it work? What's the outcome? The actual black box bit we don't maybe look into. I wonder whether specific requirements to look at data, although the volume of this data, that has its own challenges. And then when we come to talk about how things might progress later on in the future, there are some other considerations as to where this software as a medical device might fall down. But I think perhaps having had a wee idea beforehand of what we're going to discuss, that might be something that we cover a bit later on.
Coming back to as well what you're talking about, kind of the training, I heard a talk last year from someone who was looking into kind of AI in healthcare, and something that she'd flagged was in a study that had been looking at images of potential kind of cancerous tumours, the model that they were using was identifying everything as that because there was a ruler at the bottom of every image, and that was what the model was recognising rather than the actual cells. So with that in mind, what kind of risks do you think that there are with the use of AI in this sort of application?
Absolutely. So I think there are risks, and we need to approve and check the models. At the moment, that's a task that's quite manageable with the scale of everything happening and the fact that many of these things are things that human can do the task as well. Once things get to a sufficient scale, in some ways, much of what happens with these models is a bit of a black box. We get an input, we get an output, and we don't entirely understand the bit in the middle, although we can tell you a lot of stuff about what the architecture is, how many parameters, it's got some, weights and biases, or about how the architecture works. We don't necessarily fully understand what's going on underneath the hood. And as things get complex, to be honest, the chance that we'll fully understand that maybe declines a little. Although there has been some interesting work with identifying, there was one model they looked at the Golden Gate Bridge and tried to get it to bring up the Golden Gate, and they could identify, actually, it looks like this small little bit here might be related to the Golden Gate Bridge. So there is some work trying to understand how these things work. I'm trying to avoid being overly technical. But so I think as complexity increases, the chances that we can easily do that are less. Risk-wise, yes, you're in this area where wrong decisions, wrong things can be hugely consequential. But I suppose what I say to my colleagues who are a bit nervous about this is, yeah, they're right to be nervous, but turn it on its head. I mean, there are models we use regularly in healthcare that are mathematically derived. They're derived in the same way that, if you try the same sort of math that you use for markets and things like that to predict movements, as best we can. They kind of, recursive models, looking at stochastic calculus and things sometimes in the back. But they do these things and they produce a a scoring system that can predict mortality from various conditions and help us with management. And when we don't really know how that works. And when we've got, it's a very analogous situation, but when we've got evidence, and this is the thing, when we've got evidence that says, well, if you've got this model saying this, then it's likely to be right, and it exceeds what humans can do, especially at that point, an ethical question arises that it might become unethical to do that. Some of the models look at radiology, that sort of what we call narrow AI, are actually quite impressive in terms of some of them can outperform humans at very specific narrow tasks. So, you know, they might not be good at other types of scan, but if you take one specific scan upon which they are trained on one thing they're looking for, there are some models that are good at specifically very difficult to report chest x-rays. They're not actually better at many normal ones, or picking up blood clots in your lungs, that they actually can outperform humans, some of them. Equally, knowing some radiologists who are actually providing feedback whenever when they report, they're getting an AI report and they're saying, is that right or wrong, to give human feedback to help train it. Some of the reports are still worse than one might expect in some areas. Mm-hmm. But, the same will happen with, you know, if you get a biopsy for cancer and looking at cell lines, this a cancerous cell, you know, which is at the moment is a rate limiting step. If anyone that's ever had these, it's a stressful wait. And they sit there waiting for literally someone to prepare the slide, put it in, and a human physically looks at them, and they're looking for a bunch of features about the cells. Now, this is inherently, because it's image data that patterns can be picked up in, not dissimilar to a self-driving car, or, you know, when you search Google Photos and try to find out, show me things of a red car. Mm-hmm. So there's huge potential for this to speed up things for patients. And when the accuracy gets higher than humans, it might end up being unethical for us to physically have, you know, humans doing some of these tasks. As is, they want someone to sue, I think, is the bottom line.
Yes, well, moving on from that topic, we're looking, you briefly touched on challenges. So what about organisations seeking to implement AI? From your experience, what are the challenges that they're facing at the moment?
So one of the advantages of being a locum is working up and down the country. In fact, I've worked in 4 countries. So I have seen firsthand how a lot of hospitals run. And honestly, at these sort of events that I was at the House of Lords, you get people coming to you who are full of enthusiasm to implement things like this. And then when you ask them, well, how do your notes document? How does that work? And you will find in the UK particularly, it is often these massive paper notes that someone scribbles, and my colleague, myself, are writing. So the information is hard to access. And of course, there are models that can take text input and turn it, you know, handwritten input, turn it into text. Sometimes some of them might be better than humans at doing that. I sometimes struggle with some of my colleagues' writing, it must be said. But of course, there are models that can do that. It is infinitely easier, less processing intensive, and, you know, gets everything organized better to have things digitally. And I think the big problem is digital transformation has been an agenda for healthcare trusts in England and health boards in Scotland for a long time, but they're at varying stages of doing it. And only now are they starting to realize, many of them, oh, wait a minute, if we're going to do this, we want all the data to be accessible as text. So I think at the moment, one of the big things, if any of your IT contractors in the audience or any consultancy firms are looking for an area that might be big growth, I think there'll be a lot of push in the coming years towards actually getting these digital transformation projects actually off the ground and running, because otherwise they're going to be handicapped in a world that is going to increasingly have good solutions for them. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that they're short of is staff. Anything that increases productivity helps massively.
And thinking from the tech side of things, what would you say the challenges are from a cybersecurity point of view? What types of things should we be considering?
Absolutely. So there are going to be huge and very different risks in this kind of environment. One of the things to consider is, do you run models locally, or do you pay someone else to use an API in the background? Now, The local option is not something, having spoken to people, that many people are thinking about. I think there's a bit of lack of awareness at quite how good for simple tasks some of these models are. But I think, that there is something to be said for locally owning your model, not having to establish a tunnel through the internet somewhere to speak to someone else's servers. You think of things like man-in-the-middle attacks. Healthcare data is extremely sensitive. You do not want
Yeah.
that getting out. It's also potentially going to be something lucrative in terms of trusts that have got permission might want to sell that data back to train models and things. England already sold its health data. There are other threats on things like, so what is likely to happen with some of these large language models is there are strategies like retrieval augmented generation. I know it's a technical term, but that basically is where a large language model looks at some source of data that it can use to help it get the right answer. And one of the things that to be used in that way will be things like giving background and notes and things like that. So, to look at the patient's previous history or to refer to specific documents that are, I don't know, techniques or protocols from various specialities or things like that. Now, you can see then that this is an input that could be manipulated by a malicious actor, for example. Do you think if you've got some politically exposed person, your leader or something like that, that someone say tries to suppress the penicillin allergy or something like that? So there are potential threats that we might not consider from that point of view. There are, I suppose, questions of, backup systems, redundancy, people becoming more dependent upon it, and then maybe even something as simple as, well, let's denial of service that server closes your hospital down.
Yeah.
So there are huge questions about, especially as these things become bigger at scale, more interconnected, and more critical to hospital infrastructure. How do you have fail safes? How do you store the data? Because you're going to end up storing all the data. I can tell you that data security in these places, they've got some phenomenal professionals looking at it, but we're going to have so much more of it, and it's going to need to be done very carefully. And it's going to be therefore ripe for the taking if someone hacks it. In terms of, you do not want everyone's medical records being purloined.
No.
So
Or held to ransom.
Exactly. And how does ransomware affect you when it closes down a clinical decision-making pathway or affects cancer wait times for pathology slides, which are things that may come in time. It's not where we are just now with these things, but I suppose we're looking a bit further forward when we have discussions like that. So yeah, huge security challenges in terms of, if you're building this, you've got to make sure that it's not an easy target. And as simple as an exploit that makes it access someone else's notes, or would, for example, when you use these language models, there is a little bit called the instructions, which is hidden. It's effectively, before you have a talk with it, like every time the person that owns the model or the software that runs it has a little chat with it, and if you inject certain malicious instructions in there, you could dramatically influence how the models behave. For example, another thing that occurs to me in terms of threats is, you look at these phenomenal things. I actually was with someone from the team at the roundtable for Google's DeepMind, the AlphaFold project, that came up with 2 new novel antibiotics of a completely unknown class. I mean, it is something that could be great for humanity. The same sort of models, which, by the way, are under the hood, as I understand it, similar to some of the image generation models, the diffusion models, but the same sort of technique can actually be used if you turn around the reward function a bit to generate molecules that are dangerous rather than molecules that are helpful. So the same model can turn into a bioweapon factory. And indeed, there was a study where someone tried that and generated sarin gas, one of the most deadly things we've discovered, within the first 30 seconds. And along with lots of unknown, potentially dangerous compounds. So the threats are huge, as well as the opportunity being huge.
Do you think there's a risk as well? I'm thinking back to an earlier question where we spoke about risks in AI implementation generally, but then thinking about from a security point of view, if something was taken down, do you think there's a danger of an over-reliance on AI models leading to a reduction in kind of overall skill?
Certainly. One of the things I'd be concerned about is, you can almost view it as analogous to if you look at all these modern investigations that we have. So if you rewind to a time, if we go travel back in the past, a time before CT scanners, before MRI scanners, and we had to answer these questions, what we did, and we still examine people in this. We went in, we will tap with our fingers, we will listen very hard with our stethoscopes, we will lift your arm up and down, see if your blood pressure, draw your pulse disappears. And we still teach people how to do this, but their actual reliance on some of these skills is far lower. Mm-hmm. And if you look at places like Cuba, which has some phenomenal healthcare outcomes, but with actually comparatively much lower budgets. One of the things they've got, by the way, is more staff. But it is generally said, and I'm not seeing any research to back up, but generally said that their examination skills are far better. And part of that's reliance on it. And there is a little bit that the more we introduce what could be phenomenal diagnostic support and these things in terms of being able to prompt us and make us think of things, the less we train ourselves to do those things. And there is the other thing that it's going to enable them to operate with lower staff when it works. There is a question of that, how much of, shall we say, a Jenga model does that become, wherein if you take the AI out of the system, is there enough to cope in terms of staffing? But this is part of, if you run an organization, this is part of the sort of contingency planning you need to do. So you need to have redundancy. If you look at a lot of our computer systems for ordering tests, hidden away in the back, usually somewhere, someone will know where it is, hopefully. Usually they do, but hidden away in the back of some of the wards, usually in a wee cupboard somewhere, they have paper forms for requesting blood tests. Now, much to our extreme frustration, we still get paper reports sent to us, which, as a needless duplication most of the time, they require that we sign to file them. But the reason that's still there is in case the computer systems fail. It's an extension mentality of we need fail safes. What if it doesn't work? It certainly would be something I would be worried about, especially as over longer periods of time, the number of pathologists you recruit, the number of radiologists you recruit, the number of doctors and things you recruit is going to be scaled along with needs. And if those needs diminish, we might get to a point we don't have the workers. Now, that's looking long time in advance, because at the moment, we don't have the workers because we just can't hire, train, recruit, and import sometimes in terms of recruitment from abroad enough to cover our demand. But yeah, with a longer term time horizon, absolutely, the reliance on that could be a problem if things go wrong.
So in terms of that clinical implementation, what challenges there are in terms of regulation?
Okay, so I think we spoke of software as a medical device, which is where regulation is just now. It's a bit of a bodge. It works. It provides a system that you can if you're trying to bring a product to market, you can go through a process that's a known process, get approval for it, and use it. It's not tailored to AI, so it doesn't look at the diversity of the data. It doesn't look at it's not quite as, say, robust in some of the AI specific aspects. But I think if we look at where models might go, I mean, we can easily envisage a model that continues to learn. So every day it will get more information, and it might periodically do some training on that information, test it and improve. The problem is that at the end of this, I've got a different model from the model that was approved. Now, it's inherently something we might want. We might want a model that gets better and better over time. However, as is, that would probably be right back to the drawing board. Well, that's not approved.
Yeah.
There also need to be fail safes. I mean, it might be that the way to approve these things at scale is almost to have a model that interrogates them. So that we're then introducing a problem of relying on an AI to test the AI. But as the scale gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it becomes harder for humans to individually manage it.
And that obviously has inherent risks as well, because you've got AI managing AI managing AI.
Which is why you look at where all the sort of the big thought leaders are in this sector. The problem that preoccupies many of them is so-called alignment. It's keeping AI in alignment with human goals. That means basically not building an evil AI, so to speak, not having the talk of the analogy they often use. If you optimize it to build paper clips, it might look at humans and think, "Oh, great, a good source of metal for paper clips." Is the kind of slightly dystopian example that will do it. Speaking jocularly, but they're
Yeah.
trying to communicate you can give it an objective, and you want to ensure that fundamentally these things have got human interests at heart. And it's especially difficult because at the moment, the best people are probably more capable often at most tasks than many of these things.
Yeah.
Not for narrow AI. A calculator has been better for calculating things, not as an AI for a long time, but we can get machines to exceed human abilities in very small ways. But if they become, for example, AI engineers, which is something that speculated might have a big, dramatic, exponential, asymptotic takeoff at the point that AI is better at doing AI engineering than humans are, then the bottleneck of how many of these very talented people have we got ceases to become the bottleneck, and you can get exponential growth. But at that point, are we even going to be able to understand what's happening? So a lot of the things that thought leaders worry about is how can we get a handle on whatever guardrails or alignment and things on the overarching benevolence of AI to get these models acting in alignment with human interests, because there may come a point that it's a bit beyond what we can fully understand. We're not there yet, and this is at varying points in this conversation. Ball gaze into the dim, dark, distant future, which is inherently risky in terms of prediction. Where we are now, we've got problems with hallucination. We've got some very basic problems with some of these things still. But as the ability increases, and there are schools of thought that say that we might struggle to get above human ability, but equally, I think the broad consensus is as the compute increases, as the number of parameters increases, as we improve the architecture underlying these things, that we will reach a point that it will be the performance may well reach what we call artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence beyond what humans are capable of, certainly without a much, much longer time frame.
I'm gonna bounce off that, and I'm gonna ask you explicitly now, with the speed that AI solutions are being kind of devised and implemented, how do you see healthcare looking in the dim, dark, distant future, 5, 10, 20 years?
Yeah, so I think very much we're already seeing the few front runners that are starting to implement some of these things. And what we're seeing from that is that some hospitals that are implementing in America are seeing improvements in mortality from sepsis. Sepsis is a good low-hanging fruit because if you treat people early, it's well recognized there is huge potential to make reduction in mortality. We're already seeing new drug discovery. By the way, Google doing that would not be a good business model. It's great publicity because if you give me a really fantastic antibiotic, I won't use it. I'll keep that and say, I'm glad I've got that in the cupboard in case all the other ones stop working. I'll keep that one good. So the pharma industry not doing it, call me cynical, I suspect for Google, that's just very good publicity. Great. So they're not too bothered about owning the IP for that if it's not needed within the next 20 years. When big pharma starts putting these, the big pharmaceutical companies start putting these into drugs that there is a market for, I think we might see a renaissance in, lots of new cancer drugs, lots of new, we spoke about the Parkinson's research that happened. So we might start seeing things like some of these molecules, these were not known molecules that they identified that are somehow appear inextricably linked with the process. But some of these might be something we can intervene with. Maybe it's part of the disease. Maybe the work needs done. But if we find something, you might find that there's something you can interfere with and devise a drug to treat. So I think new treatments, and we might be able to optimize systems and overcome a reliance or a chronic mismatch between supply and demand and staffing. It might help address that. So I think we could be seeing lots of things with pathology processes sped up, interpretation of blood results. I strongly suspect the time is coming where it will be better than us at X-rays, CTs, blood tests, and sometimes not missing things. Because, I can read the whole Harry Potter text every time I answer a question. These models can do that effortlessly already, some of them. Their token window, their context window is large enough that they can look at all that information and give you an answer. There is a thing called a needle and haystack test. They don't always pick out everything, but they're getting better and better and better at that. So, I think we'll see huge improvements, but we're probably talking modest in the next few years, other than a few forerunners. And as the time goes on and things improve, we'll start to see this happening more and more. For the UK to see the benefit, huge digital transformation in most places is needed. Some best places, I know, for example, the RIA in Edinburgh, I work in Scotland some of the time, they have had digital case notes for a very long time now. Everything, their observations, their blood tests, all those things are in a way that might be more accessible. Whereas I'm not going to name names on places that are using paper notes, but there are plenty of places I've worked where many of these things are still stuck 2 decades in the past.
Yeah, there's a lot of industries like that. So we always ask people during our interview if there's anything that's inspired you, like to get you to where you are now, whether it's a book, a podcast, it could be a person. Is there anything that comes to mind?
It's an interesting one. I tend to be someone that, sees challenges and likes to immerse myself in them. I'm not sure actually on the answer to that one. I certainly read a lot of things and I listen to a lot of podcasts. There's some very thought-provoking ones in the AI space if you're trying to keep up with news and things like that. So I was trying to remember now, it's Wolf something, and I need to look that up. Unfortunately, Steve, I can't remember the name, but I should have looked this up before I came on. But there are a few of those things that, have been quite inspiring, but none of them that I think have really set me on the path. I'm very much someone that tries to look at what's going on with open eyes and predict where things are going. And it's been very much a sort of broad direction of travel of the world, I think, more than anything else has set me on the path. From a leadership point of view, Machiavelli's The Prince is well worth a read.
Well, that's about all we have time for today. So thank you so much, Ian, for joining us. We really appreciate it. And if you'd like to find out more about what we do at ID Cyber, you can get us at idcybersolutions.com. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.